We may not realize it yet, but in many ways, the explosion of the internet and technology is almost a kind of geological event. It swept away entire landscapes, ways of being, certitudes. Certainly for the publishing, media, and entertainment industry, it's like being yanked out of the ice age and put into a volcano. Nobody understands anymore how to make money in the old ways. All the frameworks are gone. The ways of thinking about mediating and curating creative work is gone. If you can Shazam a piece of music in a restaurant, if you can download a film or book for free, how are the creators going to be paid? But while the rest of the creative world is in a blue funk, thankfully, there is one man who is beginning to think out of the box. He's certainly part of the old world, but he has new innovative ways and understands how perhaps to save both book readers and book owners. This is John Makinson, the chairman of the Penguin and Random House Group. And just for perspective, under him is an empire, and he alone controls 25% of the books that are published in this world. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome John Makinson and Tarun Tejpal.
Right away, first, let's get the pronunciation of John's name right. It's Makinson, as in make, as in bake, not Makinson. I mean, I was getting it wrong. Welcome, John Makinson. First of all, let's just locate you. Have you been, and are you a lover of books and business, or are you a businessman selling books?
I think I spent my career patrolling the boundaries between commercial and creative activity, one way or another, whether it's in newspapers or in books. So I don't see it as kind of binary like that. I mean, I think I'm both, but am I a business person? Yeah, I am. Obviously, I'm responsible for a business with a lot of revenue that publishes a lot of books, but I'm also a book lover, and I think it would be very difficult for me to do the work that I do unless I had warm relationships with authors as well as with readers.
What are the books, John, you'd have by your bedside today?
Well, I've been reading, which may be a theme of this discussion, I don't know, Brad Stone's book about Jeff Bezos and Amazon. That's perhaps a rather kind of obvious choice. And I was also reading on the plane down here Malcolm Gladwell's new book, David and Goliath. I'm a big Gladwell fan, so that's what I'm reading right now.
John, we are seeing almost an epical transition from the written text and the printed book to a kind of digital, online avatar. For almost 600 years now, it's actually the printed book that's been, in a sense, the centerpiece of civilizations. What does this change mean for all of us?
Well, let me start by saying what I think it doesn't particularly mean. I don't think that the move from a printed page to a screen is itself a particularly significant thing, honestly. People are looking, particularly adults, it's slightly different in the children's publishing business, but in narrative fiction, narrative non-fiction, on the whole, what readers are saying is we would like to have exactly the same stuff as we had before, but we like to read it on a screen or on a mobile device rather than on a printed page. And the e-book reader, certainly the dedicated e-book reader, not the tablet, is a conservative device. It is basically reproducing exactly the same experience, but electronically. What is really different, though, is how people are reading rather than what they are reading, and what filters are being put in place, what curatorial filters, moderating filters are being put in place in order to manage the abundance of content that the digital pipeline is making available to everybody. That's, in my mind, the really fundamental issue, rather than a shift in content in itself. It's how we access the content.
There's a great deal of anxiety among publishers and the publishing trade about this shift, and that's understandable. It's got to do with jobs and employment and your vocations. Where does the resistance at the reader's end come from? Because even though they were singing the end of the written book about 15 years ago, if I'm not wrong, even today, 3/4 of books sold in the world are still physical books.
Yes, they are. I mean, slightly less than that in the United States. So what we're seeing is an adoption curve which began in America and is being followed in the United Kingdom and then in other markets, and I'm sure will happen in India as well. That's not in itself bad. It's just a choice that readers are making about how they want to relate to the content. If there was an absolute decline in reading as a result, particularly of the sort of distractions of mobile technology, then that would be very problematic for the publishing industry. And I'm not saying that's not something that could materialize, but we aren't seeing very much evidence of it at the moment.
Explain that to us. When you say disruptive, are you saying that something akin to what happened with music?
Well, I think that the parallel between books and music is made very often. We haven't seen, and I don't want to sound complacent here, but we haven't seen yet that shift that occurred in the music industry. On the whole, people still want to buy books rather than chapters, whereas in the music industry, people want to buy tracks and not albums. And people like to own books, whereas in the music industry now, people mostly want to access music. They don't necessarily have to own it. So there are shifts that have been happening in the music industry, which may become relevant in book publishing in the future, but aren't particularly problematic for us at the moment. It's not an industry that is growing very fast, but it is stable. It's not an industry in decline.
John, since we can always only locate inflection points in retrospect, and you've been at the top of the industry for almost 20 years now, if you look back now, what have the inflection points been in this transition?
I think you'd have to say that the arrival of Amazon was an enormous inflection point, because that did shift a number of established models in the publishing industry. How people acquired books, how people read books. That was, and just to finish on that point, I mean, through the industry, through the long life of the industry, the inflection points have tended to be around changes in channels of supply. So a decision by supermarkets to enter into the business, the creation of the Barnes & Noble superstores in America. Those have been the big inflection points. Actually, the content itself hasn't changed much since Gutenberg. And when we try to change it and say to the consumer, wouldn't it be wonderful if when you read your Jane Austen you had some video or some social media or some gaming alongside it, they say, no, could we just have a Jane Austen, please? But the distribution channels, those changes are always powerful inflection points in the industry.
Look, but given this sort of scale and the fundamental egalitarianism and the low cost of entry that the internet affords, does it not also in some sense end up changing the content?
It changes the quantity of the content, for
Quality?
Sure. I don't think it has to change the quality of the content. I mean, I think, again, the evidence of the last 20 years is that the curatorial role of the publishing house, if you like, is as valuable today as it was 20 years ago. I would argue it is probably more valuable than it was. And the publisher has not been displaced. If anybody's been displaced in this change, it's been the retailer.
I'm going to, John, just push this thought. And are we, people like you and me, who in some sense are very closely and intimately located with books, as either writers or publishers, are we being rather self-centered in imagining that the curatorial role that has in a sense been played by publishers for 200 years, that curatorial role will continue to have a centrality for the reader?
Well, I think the curatorial role is changing. So this is a curated event, isn't it? What is happening here is that you and your colleagues have curated this, but what everybody is here for is the spontaneous interaction between the people on the stage. So it is getting the balance between serendipitous absorption of whatever it is that we are creating, and structure and guiding people. And that curatorial role in some ways is more important than ever, just because there is so much more content available. So the filters of Facebook and Twitter and the Daily Beast, or whatever it may be, Huffington Post, these are all filters that are helping to guide us towards content that we think we will want to read. And technology is helping us to order that and to guide us in a much better way than we did before. So long as publishers engage in that process and don't regard themselves just as traditional text publishers, but they engage in the opportunities of the technology, then I think they will be fine.
There's a school of thought that's always held that volumes of dross will keep drowning out the excellent. And currently, technology makes the volumes of dross beyond any kind of imagination in the generation. So I'm still pushing that point. Are we actually at a point where we are going to see, in some sense, the decline of the truly excellent, or the band of the truly excellent, because dross will, in some sense, drown it?
Yeah, I mean, I sort of slightly question the premise of the point, which is sort of implicitly literature good, not literature not so good. I don't really sort of think in high culture, low culture terms like that. But I think I see no reason why more content should crowd out, drive out good content. What concerns me is that the practice of what I would call immersive reading, which is how we read literature, which is really to your point, may be in jeopardy. Because traditionally we have bought that Jane Austen book and we have started at the beginning, and then after a couple of lunch breaks we finished it. That's not how younger people in particular read these days, because they are distracted by other opportunities to do things. So what worries me about, if you like, literature is not that the taste for literature will decline, so long as we keep educating people, and there is a role in secondary and post-secondary education to do that, which in India I think is sometimes a bit of an issue. But I don't think literature itself is in danger, so long as people continue to read it in the way that they have done before.
We'll talk about another woman who's more famous than Jane Austen now, and your companies have had a role in creating her as a global phenomenon, E.L. Grey.
Yeah.
Tell us about E.L. Grey.
50 Shades of Grey, E.L. James.
E.L. James, exactly.
Yeah. Well, you know, that's a wonderful example of the serendipity of publishing. Who would have thought that there was a market of this size for that kind of publishing? Who would have thought it? Nobody. And when we thought about it, we figured that there was going to be an electronic market, because you could see why reading, if we want to call it politely, erotica, on an electronic screen is a good thing to do, because the physical book is not visible to people. What amazed me was that it became a physical phenomenon, and that people, mostly women, went into regular stores all over the world and bought it in hundreds of millions. Who would have thought?
Did you first publish it electronically?
Yeah, we did. She was a self-published author, and came to us sort of through our circuitous route. And actually, there was quite a big auction for it. It went for a fair amount of money. But we thought initially, this will really just be an electronic book. This is, and in America in particular, the electronic book market is very focused on kind of romance, science fiction, very genre-based publishing, if you like. So we thought it was going to be great in the electronic market, and then it turned out to be a physical phenomenon as well. And it was packaged like Jane Austen as a physical book. That was the trick, really, to make it look a thoroughly respectable read.
Who took the decision to take it offline, having succeeded?
I think that was a decision to take it. It was a Random House publication rather than that. It happened before the merger, so I wasn't around there at the time. But it was bought by the great Sunny Mehta in New York. So it's an Indian success story, really.
In fact, when I saw Sunny 3 months ago, he was trying to show me a new book of poems he'd done. Yeah. And he pointed to E.L. James and said, she's paid for it.
Yeah, I know. I know. Well, who would have thought? There's Knopf, right, which Sunny runs, which is this sort of bastion of high culture. If you want to talk about high culture, there's Knopf. And then he buys this, and everybody thought, what's this got to do with Knopf? He's paid for a lot of poetry.
Talking about Knopf, now one of the imprints that Random owned, and this incredibly huge merger that you presided over,
yeah.
The two of the largest publishing houses in the world, Penguin, Random House, decide to become one entity. How does that process get conceived of? Because it's very directly related to the future of publishing and books.
Well, the conception of it was pretty simple, really. I mean, we felt, and I felt strongly, that although Penguin and Random House, I think the two largest consumer book publishing companies in the world at that time, obviously had a lot of scale and heft, the market for books, broadly defined, was moving so fast, and the competitive landscape was changing so quickly with the intervention, not just of Amazon, but of Apple and Google and Apple and everybody else, that scale was going to be a huge asset. And that's not just to give you negotiating position, though obviously it does give you that, but to give you access to technology, to talent, to new kinds of platforms from which you can engage with readers. That scale would be a big asset for writers and readers, as well as for the people engaged in this process, the publishers themselves. So that was the thought process. And then when we looked around, we as Penguin said to ourselves, we have to, for this to be successful, we have to find a partner that shares our values and beliefs, basically, commitment to editorial freedom and integrity and independence and those things. And Random House was that partner, and I don't think anybody who knows our industry would dispute that. So after that, it became, you know, a matter of dollars and cents, largely, but that was the impetus behind it.
And what was the challenge of doing it, actually? And how has it gone so far?
The challenge of doing it is to make it as invisible and inaudible as you can, so that authors, agents, readers see no difference. But there have been a number of conversations I've had over the last 24 hours with some Penguin authors who are here, and I've asked each of them, have you noticed any difference as a result of the merger? And they've said, no. So we haven't merged any imprints, we haven't changed any editors. At the front of the business, it's the same.
Any change for the better?
But at the back, you see a lot of, so distribution centers, technology, operations, how you buy paper, printing, investment, yeah, all of that is changing a lot. But if you like, that's under the water.
So for a moment, let me pretend I'm your single greatest enemy and I'm Jeff Bezos.
Yeah.
And I say, what's wrong with the fact that I'm going to convert all the readership in the world to online reading, and I'm going to save a crap load of paper, many forests, and distribution costs, real estate costs. What's wrong with doing that?
Nothing wrong with doing that. Nothing wrong with doing that at all. I mean, online reading is great. I mean, it saves paper. It saves paper lots of different ways, because when we sell a book to Amazon, we don't get it back on the whole. Whereas if we sell a book to a physical retailer, then about 1 in 3 of the books that we sell comes back. So that is environmentally quite wasteful as a process. So we're very, very happy with electronic reading.
So why we hate Jeff Bezos really is because he gives us very little money back.
I'm not saying we hate Jeff Bezos. We love Jeff Bezos, mostly.
Actually, every single publisher I've met in the last 5 years has had problems with Amazon. So I want you to actually tell us, what is this problem with Amazon? Is it that he's cutting the margins too short? Is he flooding the market with stuff that's not good enough? What is the issue?
No, it's not that he's flooding the market with stuff. I mean, he has a big self-publishing business, and we have acquired. We are the 2 largest self-publishing organizations in the world, we and Amazon. So we are, we publish under a company called Author Solutions, of which I'm sure you will never have heard, more titles in a year, far more titles than Penguin Random House does. We publish as Penguin Random House 10,000 titles a year. We're publishing 25,000 titles a year under our self-publishing imprint. That's fine. I think that's a wonderful way for people to engage with small audiences. It's way down the end of the long tail. What's been troubling publishers about Amazon is partly the just sort of, oh my God, scale and effectiveness of a thing, and also attitudes towards pricing. So the belief that, and you could quite see it from Amazon's point of view, that the more inexpensive the book is, the better that is for the reader. Does that devalue, the publisher's concern has been, does that devalue the content? And does that send out a message about books being cheap? I think that's been at the heart of it. But people are always afraid of disruptive technologies, aren't they? When somebody comes along in any industry, it's like Apple in the music industry, and just changes the model and says, well, we're going to do it completely differently. That is scary to people who have a traditional approach to the industry. So you just have to adapt to it. But I don't think Amazon is bad for the industry. I think, back to the point we were talking about earlier about channels of supply, the more channels of supply there are, Flipkart has been a great thing, I think, for the industry in India. The more channels of supply there are, the better.
What about the author? Is the author better off through the online system?
Yeah, I mean, back to your question about the merger. I mean, the trick for a publishing company is to manage a balance of scale and intimacy, so that the author doesn't want to be writing for a huge conglomerate, right? The author wants to be writing for an editor and an imprint, and wants to be guided through that publishing process, design, editing, marketing, sales, all of that, sympathetically and effectively. And so that's our responsibility. That's our first responsibility as a publisher, is to provide that service as well as we possibly can for our authors. At that point, the author, I think, should be relatively agnostic about whether the book is electronic or physical. The difference, the biggest single difference in the move from a physical to an electronic landscape is that you are moving from a display model to a discovery model. So if you're selling books in bookshops, you put lots and lots of books in the bookshop, like in Full Circle outside, which if you haven't gone to buy books from yet, please do. We need the business. There are great books out there. Try to buy a Penguin or Random House book if you possibly can, but there are other good ones. But the books out there are displayed. You don't have that luxury in an electronic universe, because you have to go and find the book. So we have to adapt as publishers on behalf of our authors to abundance, but also to this shift to discoverability, and work closely with social media organizations in order to help people to find the books that they want.
Is piracy a fear?
Is piracy?
That people take books off, one person buys a book, duplicates it, passes it around, is that
Yeah.
a fear?
It's an issue. I mean, physical piracy was an issue as well. I mean, physical bookshops always had what they euphemistically called shrink, which was people lifting the books off the shelves. So piracy is not a new issue to the industry. It seems, and again, little complacency caveat here, that it is leveling out as an issue. It's a problem in the book industry that is narrow and deep. So in other words, there are certain categories of books which are heavily pirated, but overall, our catalogue does not suffer high levels of piracy.
There was talk, John, for some time about a coffee kiosk-like bookshop where you basically went and you picked the title you wanted. So you went there and you said, give me a copy of Sons and Lovers, and it was printed in the kiosk right there and then and handed to you. Is that something that has a future? Which is a kind of marriage between the two things.
Maybe. I mean, I started looking at the commercial applications of print-on-demand technology 20 years ago. And everybody thought at that point there was a machine called the Espresso printing machine, right? And well, it's still a very expensive kind of production technology, and for it to work properly creates all sorts of health and safety problems because the machine gets very, very hot. So it hasn't so far worked, but at some point in the future, will you be in an airport lounge and print out your John Grisham before you get on the plane? Maybe, but it hasn't happened so far.
If you sort of fast forward to 2025 or say 2030...
I'll be gone, I'll be retired, but I'm really not thinking about that
one. That's exactly what I meant. When a lot of these people in this hall...
You're going to worry about that.
have actually gone past, you know, have moved on, as Moran Cerf would have said. Will we be in a generation where this great sentimental, tactile attachment to the physical product will no longer exist? Is that something one can foresee?
It's a really good question, but and I honestly don't, I don't know the answer. What I can say is that the attachment to the physical artifact, the joy of owning, giving, sharing the book, is as present today as it has ever been. And I think that we have, as publishers, certainly we Penguin, have had more success in enhancing the quality of our physical books, making them more beautiful and desirable, than we have in enhancing the quality of electronic books, which you would think are very easy to enhance, because there's all sorts of things technologically that you could do with them. So there is no evidence at the moment that the physical book is in jeopardy. I mean, the curve in America is now flattening out very fast. And e-books represent about 35% of the market. I would have thought a few years ago they'll get to 50% pretty quickly. I'm not sure they will. Now, I think they may, well, we may reach a sort of status quo at some point where it's about 50-50. But I don't see any realistic danger, even by 2025, that the physical book is history. There's a question about physical bookshops, which are certainly in jeopardy in many parts of the world, not so much here, but in many other parts of the world they are. But the physical book, no, I think it's fine.
The physical bookshops, that's an interesting note in this discussion. We had a tendency in the 1980s, you know, there was a great, all this consolidation of the small printing houses into large printing conglomerates, and the large retail chains, which pretty much began to kill out the small independent book publisher. It seems there is actually a comeback of the indies now. Is that true?
Yeah, it is true, actually. I own a little independent bookshop in England, in Norwich, near Norwich, with my brother. And so I track the sales of this bookshop every week, and I regard it actually as the kind of leading indicator of the entire global book economy. And for 15 successive weeks, we have shown sales at that bookshop which are ahead of the same week a year ago. And that's fantastic. And we are seeing that in independent bookshops. People are returning to bookshops. Bookshops are having to do more. They're having to become cultural centers in a way that they weren't before. So we are encouraging all of our authors to go and spend time there and read there and have discussions there. So that it's a sort of miniature version of what is happening in this room is happening in a bookshop. And people are tremendously loyal to bookshops.
Is there any anecdotal evidence, I read some, John, to suggest that even today the actual selection of what a reader will read is hugely influenced by the bookseller, the librarian, and to a much lesser extent the book reviewer?
Yeah, I mean, everybody wants an answer to the question, what do I read next? And that's what the bookseller provides, the independent bookseller who knows his or her customer, can provide that guidance and service. I mean, that is possible to do electronically. It's very difficult to do in the book business as it happens. I mean, if you look at the Amazon software here, because so many books are purchased as gifts, they aren't actually telling you what this individual wants to read, they're just telling you what this individual wants to buy. So that's not a very good kind of early warning system on readership. Whereas the bookseller, the physical bookseller, can provide that service better.
In absolute terms, John, have the sales of physical books been rising?
No. The sales of physical books, I'm not talking
not
about
as a percentage,
India,
as in absolute terms.
So sales of physical books, certainly in the major markets, our biggest markets of the United States and the United Kingdom, the physical book sales are declining. In the States, quite fast. But that's just because there has been this big shift to electronic.
Let's just, before we are rung out of the stage, India, you have an India connection now. You're married to an Indian, and you run a very successful imprint in India. How do you foresee the India story in book publishing?
I think that it's taken off quite slowly. If you'd asked me if I'd been sitting here 3 years ago, I would have thought that by now the electronic book market in India will be much larger than it is. I mean, what we found in other parts of the world, and I guess this is a paradigm that applies to India, is that three conditions really need to be in place for the market to take off. And when it does take off, it takes off like a space rocket. The first is that there is a very large amount of content available. So before the reader enters this territory, you have to have a lot of stuff out there. Secondly, you have to have a number of devices that are attractive and competitively priced. And that's probably the issue at the moment in India, that the tablet hasn't become affordable enough to enough people, because the smartphone is still not a very exciting way to read books. And thirdly, you have to have platforms which are very easy to use, where you can pay for books in a very simple way. Once those three conditions are in place, you get a lift-off. I'm sure this will happen in India, but it has happened more slowly than most of us, I think, would have expected.
What's working in India in the book trade for Penguin?
What works in India very well, and I gave a lot of speech on this subject a couple of months back, is books that explain a complicated world. So serious non-fiction is a huge category in India. So Nandan was sitting up here on the stage yesterday afternoon, and his book, Imagining India, achieved a very good book, but it achieved very large scales because it's explaining complicated situation in India, and it explains it to the world. And so, you know, Gladwell I was talking about, Gladwell's huge in India. You go to China, what books do people buy and read in China? How to Get My Children into Harvard Business School. So that kind of that kind of book. There's a market for that book in India as well. But one of the things that gives me great confidence about this country, generally, I'm a great lover of India, as you know, is that, it's the argumentative Indian. It's that sort of spirit of inquiry, that curiosity about the world. That's why there are so many people here, right? I mean, it's fantastic. So that's, it's something I think to be really confident and optimistic about.
Can we go away and leave you from here sanguine that whenever the next James Joyce shows up or the next Kafka shows up, there will be publishers out there in the world who will be able to spot, print, and sell them?
Yeah, and the next E.L. James, too.
John, I think our time is up. They're just ring.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, John. That was great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.